Okay, this is the beginning of our second unit. So in our first unit, we talked about the basics of economics. We talked about scarcity and our factors of production and how we put those factors of production or resources together in order to produce goods and services. And we talked about that we have to make decisions about how we're going to use our resources. And when we do that, we make choices. And when we choose one thing over another thing, we have what we call an opportunity cost, because every time we decide to do one thing, we lose the opportunity to do or have something else. So we talked about those. Then we talked about supply and demand. And we talked about what happens that producers want to produce when the price is high, and demanders or consumers want to purchase when the price is low. If it is a normal good, we talked about comparative advantage and trade. And so we basically got the basics functions of what this course is going to be about. So when we start this unit, this is really going to be our macro introduction. All right. So what we've done so far are just basics and some micro stuff that we need to know to be able to understand the macro stuff. All right. So when we're talking about macro, we're talking about our entire economy as a whole. So not just what individual people in their individual homes are doing, but what everybody in our country is doing. So not an individual family, but all of the families, not an individual business, but all of the business. And so when we're talking about our economy as a whole, we have some economic indicators that we need to pay attention to that measure the health of our economy. All right. And so there are three indicators that we use to measure the overall health of our economy. And those three goals are economic growth. We want our economy to grow. We want it to get better. We want there to eventually be more money in our economy. We want to have more goods and services. We want to have better technology. We don't want our economy to look today like it did in the 1920s or the 1820s or the 1720s, right? The other thing is we want stable prices. We don't want our money to become worthless overnight like has happened in some countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. So we want our currency to remain stable and to stay valuable and not lose its value quickly and overnight. Right? And the other thing that we want is we want full employment. We want the people who want to work to be able to work. We want enough jobs for people to work in our economy who are willing and able to work. So our three goals for our macro economy are: we want our economy to grow, we want our prices to remain stable, and we want people to have jobs, right? And so those are the three things that we're going to look at when we're trying to decide if our economy is doing well. All right, so these next terms that we're going to use, you can be quizzed over at any point in this unit. All right, so you're going to want to go back and look over these terms. Some of them will sound familiar. Some of them will be familiar, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a different definition than you're used to. And there may be one or two that you've never heard of before. So we want to make sure that you're looking at these terms and that you get comfortable with them, because the whole rest of the course is going to be based on these terms. All right. So the first one is GDP, which is gross domestic product. And so when I ask you what GDP is, a lot of you are going to say GDP is gross domestic product, but GDP is just the acronym for gross domestic product. If I ask you what GDP is, I want for you to tell me that it is the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced in the nation during a year. All right. So we got to break that definition down and pull out what it really means. Okay. So the first thing that we've got to understand is that it says that it is where's my little pen here? Okay, that it is the total dollar value. All right, so total says we're going to add something up, and dollar says that we are going to express GDP in a dollar amount. So it will be in the billions of dollars or in the trillions of dollars, depending on what country you're in. So it is expressed in a dollar amount, and it is on final goods and services. So this does not include capital that people buy to produce their product. So here's an example. Let's say that you want to go buy a 2020 Ford Mustang. All right. And so that is your dream car. That's what you want to get. And you go to the Ford dealership and you are going to buy a 2020 Ford Mustang. And when you get that 2020 Ford Mustang, it's brand new. It has Goodyear tires on it, and it has an interstate battery in it. Okay. I don't know what kind of batteries come in it or tires, but let's just pretend for a minute. All right. When Ford bought those Goodyear tires or that interstate battery from those companies, that did not go into GDP because that wasn't the final time the battery or the tires were sold. The final time that the batteries or tires were sold were when you purchased the car. Okay. So when you go buy a product, the stuff that is included in the product, if it's a new product, doesn't go into GDP because it's capital. It's part of the input. All right. And you pay for those tires and that battery because Ford is going to include the tires and the battery in the price of the vehicle. All right. Let's say that you go to the dealership and you purchase a 2015 Ford Mustang. That does not count in GDP because it is not this year. All right. It would have counted in 2015's GDP, not in 2020's GDP. All right. But let's say you buy that 2015 Ford Mustang and you take it home and it needs a new battery. And so you go out and you purchase a 2020 battery to put in your 2015 Mustang. That battery that you purchased to put in your used car does count into GDP because it's the final time that it is bought and sold this year. All right. So that gets a little confusing when we're looking at, you've got to know that it's a total, that we're adding stuff up, that it's expressed in a dollar amount, that it is final goods and services. It does not include intermediate goods and services. And it is what is produced in the year that you're looking at, or this year if we're looking for 2020's GDP. All right. So what are we adding up? What total are we looking for? Well, these are the things that we're looking at. All right. So where C stands for consumption or consumer spending, that's what you spend at the grocery store. That's what households purchase. All right. The I is business investment. This would be Ford purchasing the tires or the battery. All right. It's purchasing capital by the business. So I stands for investment, and basically it's business spending. G is pretty easy because that's the government spending. Any money that the government spends gets added into it as the G part of GDP. And then we've got exports and imports. All right. So we're going to add exports because that's money that's coming into our country. If we export goods and services, our goods leave the country and money comes into the country. So if GDP is adding up all the money in our economy, and everything that everybody is spending on goods and services in our economy, when we export goods, then we're bringing money into our economy. So we add that money in. But we subtract out the imports because when we import goods, we're getting goods from another country and our money goes to those countries. So that money is leaving our economy and going into somebody else's economy. So let's say that you buy a Japanese vehicle. When you purchase a Honda or an Acura or a Lexus, then that money leaves the United States and goes to Japan. And so we would subtract that from our GDP. This X minus M, this part right here, X minus M, we call this net exports, or we call it the balance of trade. I really hate writing with this little pen thing. Balance of, it takes me a really long time to write that. It is called our balance of trade, and it can be positive or negative. Ours in the United States is negative. We import way more than we export. So the M is larger, so this X minus M is negative for the United States. So we also can call this, you may also see it expressed as big X with a little n. So C plus I plus G plus XN. And XN basically means X minus M. Exports minus imports are our net exports. All right, so GDP, is the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced in a single year, and you're adding up everything that anybody can spend on goods and services in the United States. So people who live in houses, consumers can spend money, businesses can spend money, the government can spend money, and then foreign countries can spend money here, but we can also spend our money in foreign countries, so we're gonna subtract that out. All right. So GDP is going to tell us how big or how much money our economy is worth. Right? The next term that we need to know is economic growth. And economic growth just means our economy expands and is able to produce more goods and services, more jobs, and more wealth. And when we're talking about wealth, we don't just mean money, right? Because you can print more money and it doesn't mean people become more wealthy. Okay. Wealth includes things that make your life better. So, for instance, if you take Apple and Steve Jobs, Steve Jobs innovated the Apple company, right? I mean, it was not doing very well, and he comes in and he's going to make it so much better in the really late 90s and early 2000s. And he personally became a wealthy person, but he made a lot of money. He made profit, right? I didn't make money because I work at Apple or I do have anything to do with Apple, but I became wealthier in terms of life satisfaction because he innovated that product. Okay, so now instead of having to purchase a set of encyclopedias and go look in a book for hours where there's an excerpt this big about something I may be interested in, I have a computer in my pocket that I can get on Google and find the answer to. And so that saves me time, energy, and money because our economy has grown in that technological factor. So wealth doesn't just mean an increase in personal monetary wealth. It's anything that saves you time, energy, and money in the long run. So economic growth, more jobs, more goods, and more wealth in the economy. All right, unemployment is the one that you think you know what it is, but there's part of it that you didn't know, most of you. Okay, so unemployment is the percentage of the civilian labor force. Civilian means non-military, so we're not looking at people who are in the military here, and we're looking at the labor force that is unemployed but is actively looking for work. So we got to define a couple of things. Labor force are people who are over the age of 15. All right, so you've got to be over the age of 15 to be counted in the labor force. So if you're 13 years old, you're not counted as unemployed, all right, if you don't have a job. Full-time students are not necessarily in the labor force. If you're a full-time student, it isn't expected that you have a job, so you don't count as unemployed if you're a full-time student. If you are retired, you are not in the labor force. So what this means is that if you want to be in the labor force, you have to either have a job or be looking for a job. Because if you don't want a job and you're not looking for a job, then you don't count as part of the labor force. So a 6-year-old shouldn't be counted as unemployed, and neither should your 85-year-old great-grandmother, right? So to be in the labor force, you have to either have a job or want a job. So to be unemployed, you have to not have a job but want a job. So you have to be looking for it. So if you're not looking for work and you don't have a job, you're not unemployed. We only count in our unemployment rate the people who aren't working but are actively looking for work. In fact, it gets down to very, very specific. You have to have, in order to be counted as employed, you have to have worked in the last week. And in order to be counted as unemployed, you have to have looked for a job in the last month. If you haven't looked for a job in the last month, you're not counted as unemployed. And that throws a lot of people off, that you think that there are people who are unemployed when really they're just out of the labor force. All right. Inflation is an easy term to remember. The definition is easy to remember, but its effects aren't always as easy to remember. So inflation just means prices go up, all right? So it's a long word that means prices rise, all right? So, and then, the technical definition is a prolonged rise in the general price level of goods and services. And what we mean by price level as compared to prices, if I say the price of paper towels goes up, that's one item, right? Well, the price of toilet paper could go down and offset that. Right? When we're talking about the general price level, we're talking about the average price of all goods and services that are in this sort of consumer market basket. So this basically it means all goods and services that most Americans buy, that the price has risen on them. Right? If prices go up, the value of your dollar goes down, because if prices increase, you cannot buy as much stuff. So it makes your purchasing power decrease. Right? So inflation means prices rise, or the price level of goods and services rise. And the effect is the value of your dollar, the purchasing power of your dollar decreases. And so how do we know if there's been inflation? Well, we look at the consumer price index. And so the consumer price index, this one throws people off. And people have a hard time remembering this one for some reason. An index is some sort of measurement or some information. So if you think about the index of a book, it's the part of the book that gives you information about where you find something in the book, right? It tells you information, right? So the consumer price index tells you information about the prices that consumers pay, right? It tells you, have your prices gone up or gone down, right? And the way it works is there's some organization in the government that that goes shopping, and they take we're gonna pretend for a moment this isn't how they actually do it, but let's pretend that you go to the grocery store and you've got a cart, a basket, a buggy in the South, right? You've got your market basket, and you're going to put in stuff that most Americans buy. So in this market basket that's on the screen here, we've got flour and milk and cereal and bread, and this may be mayonnaise, some potatoes and tomatoes. Okay, we're not going to have like caviar in the market basket. All right, there are going to be things that most Americans buy. They also include things like oil changes, like the price of cell phones, a tire change, things that Americans have to do. So they're going to take those prices and they're going to average them together. And what they're going to do is they're going to do that same thing next month. They're going to take the exact same items. They're going to put it in their little basket. They're going to average the price of the items. If the average price has gone up from the base month or base year, there's been inflation. If the average price has gone down, then there has been deflation. So inflation tells us prices have risen, and the way we know is we look at the consumer price index, which is basically a market basket of goods and services that we measure the price of. And we'll spend a long time working with consumer price indices and how to measure them and how to determine how much or how little inflation there has been. All right, the next term is stagflation. And I'll show you how to graph this in the future. But basically, what you need to understand right now is usually inflation happens, prices happen because there's more money, more economic growth, right? If there's more money in the economy and people are spending more money, then prices are going to go up. Right? The problem with stagflation is that you've got people not spending money, but prices are still going up. So the economy is not growing, it's not getting better, but prices are still going up. This happened in the 1970s. Some of your parents were born around this time. Your grandparents could talk to you about the increase in prices that happened in the 70s, and seeing things like, especially with gas, there were embargoes with gas as well, but there were long gas lines. Interest rates were really, really high. Prices just skyrocketed during the 1970s, but the economy wasn't growing. So this is a huge problem. If the economy is growing and prices go up, let's simplify. If you make more money and prices go up, you may not be any worse off than you are now, because if something used to cost $5 and now it costs 10, but your income also doubled, it's still taking the same percentage of your income, right? You're not any better or worse off. But if the prices double, but your salary doesn't, then you can't buy as much stuff and your purchasing power has completely decreased, and you're much worse off than you were before. All right. Okay. Getting towards the last two, the first of the last two is aggregate demand. So we've talked about demand, and we have said that demand was the relationship between the price of a particular good and the quantity demanded of that particular good. It's how much of an item people wanted to buy at a specific price. All right. Aggregate demand, aggregate is just a fancy word for total, okay? All. And so if demand is the demand for one item, aggregate demand is the demand for all items in the United States, everything put together. So it is the total of all planned expenditures, spending, people purchasing things in the economy, all of it together. It is determined by price level. The word by is missing there. Aggregate demand is determined by price level. So again, not the price of one item, but the average price of all goods and services in our country. All right. It looks like a demand curve. So here is our aggregate demand curve where price level is on the y-axis and our GDP is on the x-axis. We'll get into the difference between real and nominal GDP in the future. But real GDP is down here on your x-axis, and our aggregate demand curve slopes downward. So when price levels rise, real GDP will decrease. Okay, the aggregate demand will decrease. All right. Aggregate supply, so this shows you an aggregate demand curve here and an aggregate supply curve here. If supply is production of one item, aggregate supply is the production of all items in our country. And so they're just like the supply curve, the aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward because there is a positive relationship between price levels and real GDP. So as price level increases, so does real GDP. All right. Those are our words for now. We will add in the business cycle, and we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between, we'll talk about measuring GDP, and we'll talk about the difference between real and nominal GDP. We'll talk about how to calculate CPI and inflation next week. So today we're just worried about definitions. Be prepared to possibly quiz on this next week. To possibly, definitely, possibly, maybe, definitely quiz on this next week. Okay. I will see you later. Have a good one.